My SEL told me that my wedding dress is the worst gown she has ever seen, but my brother's speech revealed her plans to ruin my wedding. My sister-in-law Courtney would not shut up about my wedding dress from the moment she saw it. "That neckline makes you look desperate for attention," she said during my fitting. "The lace looks like old curtains. Are you sure you want to wear something so dated?" This was my grandmother's dress that she'd worn in 1952, restored and altered to fit me perfectly. It meant everything to me, but Courtney acted like I'd picked it from a dumpster. She'd send me links to other dresses daily. "This would hide your arms better." Or, "This one would make you look less bottom-heavy." When I said I was happy with my choice, she'd sigh and say, "Some people just don't want to look their best on their wedding day." At my bridal shower, she told everyone she'd tried to help me find something more flattering, but I was too stubborn to listen. "I even offered to pay for a better dress, but she insists on wearing that old thing," she announced to 40 guests. My mother was furious but kept quiet to avoid drama. Courtney brought fabric samples to my bachelorette party, just in case you change your mind. We could still order something decent if we rush ship. She spent the entire night telling strangers at the bar about how I was making a huge mistake with my dress choice. "She's going to look back at photos and cry," she kept saying. The week before the wedding, Courtney called my photographer, told her to avoid full-length shots because the dress was unflattering, called my makeup artist to suggest heavy contouring to balance out what the dress did to my face, called the florist to recommend bigger bouquets to distract from the dress. They all called me confused and uncomfortable. She showed up to the rehearsal dinner with a garment bag. "I brought a backup dress just in case you come to your senses." It was this tight, revealing thing covered in sequins. This is what modern brides wear. That old dress makes you look like you're cosplaying your grandmother. My husband Tom told her to stop, but she said she was trying to save me from myself. On my wedding morning, while I was getting ready, Courtney kept making comments. "The lighting is really showing how yellow that old fabric is." And, "Are you sure you want your arms out like that?" My bridesmaids were ready to throw her out, but I told them to ignore her. I had my reasons for staying calm. As I walked down the aisle, I heard Courtney whisper to someone, "She looks like she's wearing a costume from a community theater production." But everyone else was crying at how beautiful the dress looked. My grandmother, who was 93 and there in her wheelchair, was sobbing with joy seeing her dress again. After the ceremony, during cocktail hour, Courtney cornered different relatives to point out everything wrong with my dress. The uneven hem from the alterations, the way the beading had dulled with age. The silhouette was unflattering for my body type. She didn't know my cousin Jana was recording the speeches for my grandmother, who was hard of hearing. The reception was when things got interesting. Courtney had been married to my brother James for 8 years. Their wedding had been this massive, expensive affair where she'd worn a $20,000 designer dress that she talked about constantly. "Now that was a real wedding dress," she'd always say. During the speeches, James stood up to give his best man's toast. But instead of talking about Tom and me, he started talking about Courtney. "Seeing my sister in my grandmother's dress today made me realize something important," he said. The room went quiet. "It made me realize that some people understand what matters in a marriage and some people don't." Courtney smiled, thinking he was about to agree with her about the dress. James continued, "My sister chose a dress that represents family, history, and love. It's the same dress our grandmother wore when she married our grandfather, and they were together for 67 years until he passed." He turned to look directly at Courtney. "My wife spent our entire wedding planning, obsessed with having the most expensive everything. The dress, the flowers, the venue. She said it was about making memories, but it was really about showing off." Courtney's face was turning red. "That $20,000 dress she never stops talking about? She wore it once. It's sitting in our closet in a bag that costs more than most people's rent. Meanwhile, my sister is wearing a dress that's been worn by the woman who taught us what love actually looks like." He pulled out an envelope. "Courtney, since you're so concerned about appearances and what people wear, maybe you should know that everyone here has been talking about your outfit today." She looked down at her dress, a white lace cocktail dress she'd worn to my wedding. James held the envelope higher, and I watched Courtney's smile turn stiff, like plastic that had been left in the sun too long. The room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. James opened the envelope and pulled out his phone, holding it up so everyone could see the screen. "Inside this envelope are screenshots that Jana took during cocktail hour," he said, his voice carrying across the entire reception hall. "Recordings of my wife telling 3 different relatives that my sister looks like she's wearing a costume from a community theater production." A fork clattered onto someone's plate near the back, the metal sound echoing through the silence. I saw heads turning, people leaning toward each other to whisper. Courtney's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds flat. She pushed her chair back so fast it scraped against the floor, and her white lace dress caught the light from the chandelier as she stood up. "James," she started, but he held up his hand and kept talking over her. "Sit down, Courtney. You've spent 6 months criticizing my sister's choices, and now everyone gets to hear about it." His voice was calm, but there was something hard underneath it, like steel wrapped in velvet. Courtney opened her mouth again, then closed it. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed the edge of the table. After what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds, she slowly sat back down in her chair. Her face was bright red now, and I could see a vein pulsing in her neck. James tapped his phone screen a few times, and suddenly Courtney's voice filled the room through the reception hall's sound system. I tried everything to get her into something decent, but she insisted on that yellowed old rag. Some people just have no taste. The audio was crystal clear, and I recognized the background noise from cocktail hour, the clinking glasses and low music. Several guests gasped out loud. I looked over at my mother and saw her hand fly up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Two of my aunts at the next table were staring at Courtney like they'd never seen her before. Jana was standing near the DJ booth with her phone still in her hand, looking both nervous and satisfied at the same time. Tom's hand found mine under the table, his fingers warm and steady as they squeezed tight. James kept talking, his eyes scanning the room. My wife called the photographer, the makeup artist, and the florist to try to sabotage my sister's wedding because she couldn't handle that someone else's choices were different from hers. I watched as the photographer at the back of the room started nodding her head up and down really fast, confirming the story to the guests sitting near her table. The woman next to the photographer put her hand on her arm and whispered something, probably asking if it was true. More people were whispering now, a low buzz of voices spreading through the room like ripples in water. Courtney found her voice again and stood up, her chair scraping backward a second time. Her hands were still shaking, and when she tried to smooth down her white dress, I noticed her fingers were trembling. This is ridiculous, James. I was trying to help. Someone needed to tell her the truth about that dress. But her voice cracked right in the middle, breaking on the word truth like it was too heavy to carry. Several guests were now whispering to each other and glancing back and forth between Courtney and me, their faces showing they were starting to understand what had really been going on. My bridesmaid Megan reached over from her seat and squeezed my other hand, the one Tom wasn't holding. James turned to look at Courtney, and I saw something on his face I'd never seen before when he looked at her. It was disappointment mixed with something harder, something that looked like he'd made up his mind about something important. You wore a white dress to my sister's wedding, Courtney. White. To someone else's wedding. And you think you were trying to help? The murmuring in the room got louder, people actually talking out loud now instead of just whispering. I saw guests who hadn't seemed to notice Courtney's dress before now staring at her outfit with their mouths hanging open. One of Tom's aunts actually pointed at Courtney's white lace cocktail dress, then covered her mouth with her hand like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. My grandmother wheeled her chair forward a little bit, the wheels making a soft squeaking sound on the floor. The room went quiet again, everyone turning to look at her. That dress your wife is criticizing was the dress I wore when I married the love of my life. We had 67 years together before he passed. Her voice was strong despite her being 93 years old, stronger than I'd heard it in months. She looked directly at Courtney, not blinking, not looking away. How many years do you think your marriage will last if this is how you treat family? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I saw several people at nearby tables wince at how direct it was. Courtney's face crumpled like paper being crushed in someone's fist. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair, the metal clasp making a clicking sound. I don't have to listen to this. James, we're leaving. She said it like an order, like she expected him to jump up and follow her out. But James didn't move from his spot at the microphone. He just stood there, staring at her with that same disappointed look on his face. The seconds ticked by. 5, 10, 15. People were frozen in their seats, watching to see what would happen. Courtney's face went from angry to confused, to something that looked like panic as she realized James wasn't coming with her. James finally moved, but instead of walking toward Courtney, he set down the microphone on the head table and walked over to where our grandmother sat in her wheelchair. He knelt down beside her chair, one knee on the floor, and looked up at her face. I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something months ago when this all started. His voice was quieter now, meant for her but loud enough that people nearby could still hear. Grandmother reached out and patted his hand with her wrinkled fingers, then leaned down and said something too quiet for the rest of us to hear. I watched James's shoulders relax a little bit as he nodded, and I saw what looked like tears in the corners of his eyes. Courtney was still standing by her chair, her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. She looked around the room, probably trying to figure out if she should actually leave by herself or keep waiting for James. Her teenage daughter Savannah got up from her seat at the family table and walked across the dance floor toward me. She stopped next to my chair and bent down, her long hair falling forward as she whispered near my ear. I'm sorry my mom was so mean about your dress. You look really beautiful. The simple kindness from my niece made my eyes start to water, and I had to blink fast to keep from crying and ruining my makeup. I thanked Savannah quietly and squeezed her hand, not trusting myself to say more without crying. The DJ must have sensed the room needed a shift because upbeat music suddenly filled the space, something light and happy that made people start moving again. My Aunt Linda was the first one up, pulling my Uncle Mike onto the dance floor with a laugh that broke the heavy silence. Other guests followed, chairs scraping against the floor as they stood and stretched. My cousin from Tom's side came over and hugged me tight, whispering that the dress was stunning and she hadn't known about the family history. Then Tom's grandmother approached with her walker, moving slowly but determined, and she touched the lace on my sleeve with gentle fingers. She told me her own mother had sewn her wedding dress by hand in 1948, and she understood what it meant to wear something made with love instead of bought for show. More relatives gathered around, forming a small crowd near my chair, and they all wanted to know about the dress now. How old was it really? Did grandmother still have photos from her wedding? Had the alterations been difficult? I found myself telling the story over and over, about finding the dress in grandmother's attic last year, about the restoration process that took 3 months, about how the seamstress cried when she saw the original beadwork. Someone asked if grandmother had done all the beading herself, and I nodded, pointing to where she sat in her wheelchair surrounded by her elderly friends. They were all leaning in close, examining something on the table in front of them, probably the photos I'd given her earlier. My mother's sister came up and apologized for not saying something at the bridal shower when Courtney was being cruel. She said she'd been shocked into silence but regretted it now. I told her it was okay, that I'd had my reasons for staying calm through all of Courtney's comments. Another aunt mentioned that she'd always thought Courtney was too focused on money and status, that it was nice to see someone prioritize meaning over price tags. The comments kept coming, warm and supportive, and I realized that Courtney's behavior had bothered more people than I'd known. They'd all just been waiting for someone to say something first. I glanced toward the exit and saw James standing near the door with Courtney. She was talking fast, her hands moving in big gestures, pointing back toward the reception hall and then at herself. Her face was red and her mouth was moving quickly like she was trying to explain or defend or maybe demand something. James stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression completely blank. He wasn't nodding or agreeing or even responding to whatever she was saying. Every few seconds she'd pause like she expected him to answer, but he just stood there looking at her with that same flat, disappointed expression. She grabbed his arm at one point and he pulled away gently but firmly, shaking his head. Her gestures got bigger and more frantic, and I could see even from across the room that she was getting desperate. She kept glancing back at the reception like she was worried about what people were thinking or saying. James said something short, just a few words, and Courtney's whole body went rigid. She stared at him for a long moment, her mouth open like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Then she grabbed her small clutch purse from where it had been tucked under her arm, turned on her heel, and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back at James or the reception or anyone. The door closed behind her with a soft click that I couldn't actually hear over the music, but somehow felt. James stood there alone for another minute, staring at the closed door, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. When he finally turned around and walked back into the reception, he looked exhausted, but also lighter somehow, like he'd just set down something heavy he'd been carrying for years. Several people patted his shoulder as he passed, and he nodded at them with a small, tired smile. Tom appeared beside me and held out his hand. The DJ was playing our first dance song, the one we'd chosen months ago, and Tom pulled me onto the dance floor. His arms wrapped around my waist and I rested my head against his shoulder as we started swaying to the music. The dress moved beautifully, the skirt flowing around my legs exactly like I'd imagined it would. Tom leaned down and whispered right next to my ear so only I could hear. His breath was warm against my skin and his voice was full of admiration and a little bit of amazement. I laughed despite everything that had just happened, despite the drama and the tension, and Courtney storming out. Tom was right that James's speech had been incredible. But more than that, I realized the whole confrontation had made this day mean something deeper than just a pretty wedding. It had become about standing up for what matters, about family supporting each other, about choosing substance over superficiality. If everything had gone smoothly and Courtney had just kept her mouth shut and James had given a normal best man speech, this would have been a nice wedding. Instead, it became a day when my family actually took a stand for something real. Tom spun me gently, and the beading on the dress caught the lights, throwing tiny sparkles across the dance floor. Other couples joined us, filling the space with movement and laughter, and the mood shifted from tense to celebratory. My mother danced with my father nearby, and she caught my eye and smiled with tears on her cheeks. James danced with Savannah, his daughter looking up at him with obvious pride and relief. The song ended and another started, something faster, and suddenly everyone was dancing and laughing, and the reception felt like an actual party instead of a courtroom. Jana found me when I stepped off the dance floor to catch my breath. She had her phone in her hand and was scrolling through something, her face serious. She pulled me aside to a quieter corner near the windows where the music wasn't quite so loud. She held up her phone and showed me the screen, which displayed a list of audio files with dates and times. There were dozens of them, stretching back 6 months. Jana explained that she had about 45 minutes of recordings total, every single time Courtney had made a comment about my dress at family gatherings. Easter dinner when Courtney told everyone I was making a huge mistake. Mother's Day brunch when she brought fabric samples. The 4th of July barbecue when she cornered my bridesmaids to tell them they should talk me out of wearing the dress. Jana scrolled through the list, showing me dates I'd forgotten, moments I hadn't even known about because I wasn't there. She said James had asked her to document everything after the bridal shower incident, that he'd been building a case this whole time. I stared at the phone, stunned. My brother had been planning this confrontation for months, carefully gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Jana said he'd asked her to record today specifically because he knew Courtney would say something during cocktail hour, and he wanted proof. She'd been walking around with her phone recording, capturing Courtney's comments to different relatives. The audio clip James had played during his speech was just a small sample of what Jana had collected. I asked why she'd agreed to do it, and Jana shrugged, saying that someone needed to stand up to Courtney and she was tired of watching her tear me down. She offered to send me the recordings, but I told her I didn't need them. The point had been made. Courtney's behavior was out in the open now, and everyone knew exactly who she was. Mom found me near the cake table a little while later. The cake was 3 tiers of vanilla with raspberry filling. Simple and elegant. Nothing like the 7-tier monstrosity Courtney had at her wedding. Mom's eyes were red like she'd been crying, and she pulled me into a tight hug without saying anything at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion and regret. She said she should have shut Courtney down at the bridal shower, that she was wrong to stay quiet when Courtney was being so cruel in front of 40 guests. I hugged her back and told her it was okay, that sometimes staying quiet is strategic, that I'd had my reasons for not making a scene. Mom pulled back and looked at me with this fierce expression, shaking her head hard. She said no, that some things you don't stay quiet about, and family disrespect is one of them. She should have stood up for me when Courtney announced to everyone that she'd offered to pay for a better dress. She should have said something when Courtney brought those fabric samples to the bachelorette party. She'd been trying to keep the peace and avoid drama, but all she'd done was enable Courtney to keep attacking me. I squeezed her hands and told her I understood, that I wasn't angry at her, that everything had worked out the way it needed to. Mom wiped her eyes and said she was proud of me for staying true to what mattered, for not letting Courtney bully me into changing my choice. She touched the lace on my shoulder and said I looked exactly like grandmother had in the old photos, beautiful and confident and completely myself. James appeared next to Tom and me while we were standing near the cake, waiting for the photographer to set up for the cutting photos. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands shoved in his pockets. He cleared his throat and said he needed to apologize for making a scene at our wedding. He said he just couldn't let Courtney get away with it anymore, especially after she'd worn white. Tom shook his head and put a hand on James's shoulder, telling him there was nothing to apologize for. I agreed, saying that his speech actually made me feel more supported than I'd felt in years. All those months of Courtney's criticism, all those little digs and comments and suggestions that I was making a terrible choice, they'd made me feel alone even though I knew I was right. Having James stand up publicly and validate my choice, having him call out Courtney's behavior in front of everyone, it meant everything. James looked relieved and some of the tension left his shoulders. He admitted he'd been planning the speech for weeks, working on exactly what to say, how to say it. He'd been scared to actually go through with it, worried about what it would mean for his marriage, but seeing Courtney in that white dress had been the final straw. Tom asked if James was okay, if he needed anything, and James said he was fine. Tired, but fine. He glanced toward where Savannah and Nolan were sitting with some other kids, eating cake and laughing. He said he'd deal with whatever came next, but he couldn't regret standing up for what was right. Grandmother called me over to her table with a wave of her wrinkled hand. Several of her elderly friends were sitting with her, women I'd known my whole life as her bridge club and church group. They were all leaning forward in their chairs, looking at me with bright, interested eyes. Grandmother told me to show them the beading on the bodice, that she'd done all of it by hand in 1952. I moved closer and turned slightly so they could see the intricate pattern of tiny beads sewn into the lace. The beads formed delicate flowers and vines that ran across the bodice and down the sides, each one placed with careful precision. Grandmother's friends reached out with gentle, careful fingers to touch the beads. They made soft sounds of appreciation, ooh and ah, commenting on how tiny the beads were and how steady Grandmother's hands must have been. One of them, a woman named Margaret who'd known Grandmother since they were girls, said that nobody makes dresses like this anymore. She said it was real craftsmanship, the kind of work that took patience and skill and love. Another friend asked how long the beading had taken, and Grandmother said 3 months of working every evening after dinner. She'd wanted her dress to be special, something she'd made herself, something that would last. The women nodded in understanding, and one mentioned that she'd sewn her own wedding dress too, back in 1950. They started sharing stories about their weddings, about homemade dresses and small ceremonies and marriages that had lasted 40, 50, 60 years. I stood there listening, surrounded by these women who'd built lives on substance instead of show, and I felt connected to something bigger than just my own wedding day. Savannah approached me carefully, like she wasn't sure if I'd want to talk to her after everything with her mother. She asked quietly if she could take a photo with me, saying she wanted to remember what the dress really looked like, not what her mom had said about it. I smiled and put my arm around her shoulders as someone nearby offered to take the picture with Savannah's phone. We posed together, both smiling, and the photographer took several shots. After the photos, Savannah didn't leave right away. She stood there fidgeting with her phone, looking down at her feet. Then she admitted in a rush that her mom had been really stressed lately about money and her dad's job. She thought maybe her mom was jealous that I was having a wedding without going into debt. The words came out fast, like she'd been holding them in and finally had to let them out. I looked at Savannah, really looked at her, and saw how much she'd been carrying, how aware she was of her parents' problems. I thanked her for telling me and said I knew it must be hard being in the middle of everything. Savannah nodded and said she loved her mom, but sometimes her mom said mean things when she was stressed. She asked if I was mad at her mom, and I chose my words carefully. I said I wasn't mad, but I was hurt, and that sometimes adults handle stress in ways that hurt other people. Savannah seemed to understand, and she hugged me quickly before going back to sit with her brother. The information from Savannah stayed with me, making me think about Courtney differently. I'd known James got a pay cut 6 months ago because he'd mentioned it at Easter dinner. That was right when Courtney's criticism had intensified, right when she started sending me dress links daily and calling my vendors. Her comments about expensive dresses and better choices might have been less about my actual dress and more about her own financial regrets. Maybe she was looking at the $20,000 she'd spent on her designer dress, money that was now just sitting in a garment bag in their closet, and realizing they could have used that money for something practical. Maybe watching me have a meaningful wedding without going into debt made her confront choices she'd made 8 years ago. It didn't excuse her behavior, didn't make the months of criticism okay, but it added context that made her seem more human and less like a villain. She wasn't just being cruel for the sake of being cruel. She was projecting her own fears and regrets onto my choices. Understanding that didn't change what had happened, but it did soften something inside me, made me feel less angry and more sad for her. The evening moved forward and I found myself near the dessert table when Nolan came running up. He was 10 years old with chocolate cake smeared on his cheek and that open, honest expression kids have before they learn to hide their feelings. He asked me directly why everyone was mad at his mom. I froze for a second, trying to figure out how to explain adult conflicts to a child who just wanted his family to be okay. I knelt down so I was at his eye level and said that sometimes grown-ups disagree about what's important. His mom and I have different ideas about weddings, about what makes them special. I told him that his mom thought expensive things were important, and I thought family history was important, and sometimes when people have different ideas, they argue. Nolan thought about this for a minute, his face serious. Then he asked if I was still his aunt, and I said of course, always. He seemed satisfied with that answer, and asked if he could have another piece of cake. I laughed and said yes, and he ran off toward the dessert table. The crisis apparently resolved in his mind. I watched him go and wished adult problems could be solved so easily, with simple explanations and permission to eat more cake. I watched Nolan disappear into the crowd of relatives near the cake table, his crisis solved with such beautiful simplicity that I felt a pang of envy. Adults couldn't fix their problems with explanations and permission for dessert. Tom's parents found me a few minutes later, his mother approaching with her purse over her shoulder and his father's coat draped across her arm. She took both my hands in hers, squeezing gently, her eyes warm and sincere. Her words about the dress being stunning and the story making it more beautiful settled something inside me that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. I thanked her, meaning it completely, grateful that my new in-laws understood what wearing grandmother's dress represented to me. They left with hugs and promises to see us before the honeymoon, and I felt lucky to be joining their family. The reception was winding down now, guests trickling toward the exits in small groups, the energy shifting from celebration to tired contentment. I spotted grandmother sitting alone at her table, her wheelchair positioned so she could watch the remaining dancers, and I made my way over to sit beside her. She patted the chair next to her and I sank into it, kicking off my shoes under the table with relief. She started telling me about her wedding day in 1952, her voice soft but clear, describing how simple everything had been compared to modern celebrations. No elaborate decorations or expensive venues, just family and friends in a small church with homemade food at the reception afterward. Her eyes got distant with memory as she described how happy she'd been despite the simplicity, how none of the material things mattered when she was marrying the man she loved. She turned to look at me directly, her hand finding mine on the table. Her next words about the dress not making the marriage hit me hard, the truth of them settling deep in my chest. She explained that her happiness with grandfather came from respecting each other and working as a team through all the years, through arguments and struggles and joys. That foundation of respect and teamwork was what lasted through 67 years, not the dress or the flowers or the venue. I squeezed her hand, feeling tears prick my eyes again, understanding that she was giving me the real gift tonight, not just the dress, but the wisdom that came with it. Jana appeared at my elbow holding her phone, her expression somewhere between amused and concerned. She showed me the screen, revealing a string of text messages from various family members, all asking for copies of the recordings she'd made. Linda wanted to know exactly what Courtney said at Easter dinner. Mike was asking about Thanksgiving comments. 3 cousins were requesting the full cocktail hour footage. I stared at the messages, feeling a mix of vindication and exhaustion at the thought of the recordings circulating through the family like currency. I told Jana to delete everything, my voice firm despite my tiredness. The point had been made tonight, publicly and clearly, and I didn't want to fuel more family drama by letting those recordings spread. Jana nodded, seeming relieved by the decision, and I watched her thumb through the deletion process right there in front of me. She thanked me for not letting this turn into a bigger mess than it already was, and I appreciated her loyalty throughout this whole situation. James found me near the coat check as the last guests were gathering their belongings, his face serious in a way I'd rarely seen. He asked if we could talk privately, and I followed him into a side room off the main hall, closing the door behind us to muffle the sounds of the reception. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking more uncertain than I'd ever seen my confident older brother look. When he finally spoke, the words came out heavy and deliberate, explaining that he was probably going to separate from Courtney for a while. My stomach dropped at the announcement, even though part of me had been expecting something like this after his speech. He continued before I could respond, clarifying that this wasn't just about my dress or tonight's confrontation, but about how Courtney treated people when she thought no one important was watching. He'd been noticing patterns for months, ways she spoke to service workers and family members, how she valued appearances over authenticity in every aspect of their lives. Tonight had just been the final confirmation that his marriage had problems that went beyond financial stress or temporary difficulties. I felt shock wash over me, but also immediate concern for Savannah and Nolan, asking what would happen to them after everything they'd witnessed tonight. James's face softened when I mentioned the kids, and he explained he'd been thinking about this decision for months, not making it impulsively based on one dramatic evening. He'd been considering what kind of example he was setting for his children by staying in a marriage built on superficial values and constant criticism. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Tonight had shown him that Savannah and Nolan were already being affected by their mother's behavior, already learning to measure worth by appearances and price tags. He thought separating might actually be healthier for them in the long run than watching their parents pretend everything was fine. He assured me he'd handle everything carefully, put the kids first, make sure they had stability and support through whatever came next. I hugged him tightly, feeling proud of him for making a hard choice, and sad that it had come to this point. Tom found us a few minutes later and we said goodbye to the remaining family members before heading to our hotel suite around midnight. We collapsed onto the bed, still in our wedding clothes, too exhausted to change immediately, just lying there staring at the ceiling. Tom broke the silence by saying this was the most dramatic wedding he'd ever been to, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and amusement. He turned his head to look at me, a smile playing at his lips, and added that somehow it had been perfect because it was real. No pretending, no fake smiles, just honest feelings and genuine confrontation. I laughed despite my exhaustion, realizing he was right. Our wedding would be memorable not because everything went smoothly, but because it revealed truths that needed revealing. We'd started our marriage with honesty and authenticity, which felt like a better foundation than a perfect facade. I woke up the next morning to my phone buzzing constantly on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with message after message. I grabbed it and scrolled through the flood of texts and calls from family members, my eyes barely open. Most messages were supportive, thanking James for finally speaking up about Courtney's behavior, saying someone needed to address her constant criticism and status obsession. Several aunts and uncles sent long texts about times they'd witnessed Courtney being cruel or dismissive to family members. A few messages were critical, though, saying James had embarrassed his wife publicly and should have handled everything privately like adults. One cousin wrote that airing marital problems at a wedding was inappropriate regardless of the circumstances. The family was clearly divided about whether the public confrontation had been the right approach or a terrible breach of etiquette. I showed the messages to Tom over coffee in the hotel room, and we discussed how split opinions were, how some people valued public honesty, while others prioritized private discretion. My mother called around 9 in the morning, her voice tight with stress and exhaustion. She told me Courtney had shown up at her house at 7 that morning, crying and demanding that Mom make James apologize for humiliating her. Mom had apparently stood her ground, telling Courtney she couldn't make a grown man do anything, and maybe Courtney should think about why James felt the need to say those things publicly. Courtney had left angry, according to Mom, saying the whole family had turned against her, and she was being unfairly blamed for trying to help me make better choices. Mom sounded drained by the confrontation, caught between sympathy for Courtney's distress and agreement with James's assessment of the situation. She asked how I was doing, and I assured her I was okay, that last night had been intense but ultimately freeing. My phone buzzed with a text from James asking if I was okay, and apologizing again for the drama at my wedding. I called him back instead of texting, and we ended up talking for over an hour about everything. His marriage problems, Courtney's insecurities about money and status, his concerns about how the separation would affect the kids. He admitted he'd been unhappy for years but stayed because divorce seemed like failure, like giving up on something he should be able to fix through effort and compromise. Watching me stand firm in my choices about the dress and the wedding had made him realize he'd been compromising his own values to keep peace in his marriage. He'd been prioritizing surface harmony over authentic connection, and it was eating away at who he was as a person. I listened, offering support and understanding, telling him I was proud of him for choosing honesty, even though it was harder than pretending. 3 days after the wedding, my phone rang with Courtney's name on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, my finger hovering over the decline button, but curiosity won out, and I answered. Her voice came through immediately, high-pitched and accusatory, telling me I'd destroyed her marriage and turned her children against her. She said Savannah wouldn't talk to her, that her daughter called her mean and critical, that this was all my fault for being stubborn about that stupid dress. I felt anger rise in my chest at her refusal to take any responsibility, at her continued insistence that my dress choice was the problem rather than her behavior. I took a breath and held the phone steady, keeping my voice level even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Courtney, I didn't destroy your marriage. Your behavior toward me was just a symptom of bigger problems between you and James. And for the record, it's not a stupid dress. It's my grandmother's dress, and it means more to me than any designer gown ever could. The line went dead before I finished the sentence. She'd hung up on me. I stared at my phone screen showing the ended call, then set it down on the kitchen counter and pressed my palms flat against the cool granite. Tom walked in carrying grocery bags and took one look at my face. He set the bags down and came over, wrapping his arms around me from behind. I leaned into him, letting out a long exhale. She called, I said quietly. Tom's arms tightened. What did she say? I turned to face him. That I destroyed her marriage and turned Savannah against her. That it's all my fault because I was stubborn about the dress. Tom shook his head slowly. You know that's not true, right? James made his own choice based on years of problems, not one dress at one wedding. I nodded, but my stomach still twisted with guilt. We were supposed to leave for Hawaii in 2 days. The honeymoon we'd been planning for months. But now James was separating from his wife. The kids were caught in the middle and my whole family was in chaos. How could I just fly off to a beach resort and pretend everything was fine? Tom must have read my expression because he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. You're thinking about canceling the trip, he said. It wasn't a question. I sat across from him, twisting my wedding ring around my finger. Maybe we should postpone, just until things settle down a bit. James might need support, and Mom is stressed, and the kids. Tom reached across the table and took my hand, stopping the nervous ring spinning. Your brother is an adult making his own choices. You being stressed and available won't change anything. He has his own apartment, his own lawyer, his own path to figure out. We can't fix his marriage. I wanted to argue, but Tom kept going. We've been planning this honeymoon for 8 months. We both took time off work. The resort is paid for. And more importantly, we deserve to start our marriage with time for just us, not jumping straight into family crisis mode. He squeezed my hand. James would tell you the same thing if you asked him. I knew Tom was right, but it still felt wrong to leave. Like I was abandoning everyone when they needed me most. But what would staying actually accomplish? I couldn't make Courtney take responsibility for her actions. I couldn't make James's separation easier. I couldn't fix years of marriage problems in a few days. Tom stood up and started unpacking the groceries, giving me space to think. I watched him put away milk and bread and vegetables, these simple domestic actions that represented our new life together. This was what mattered. Building our partnership, not getting sucked into drama that wasn't ours to solve. My phone rang again and I jumped, but this time it was grandmother's number on the screen. I answered immediately. Hi, Grandma. Her voice came through warm and familiar. Hello, sweetheart. I was hoping you could visit before you leave for your trip. I have something I want to show you. I agreed to come by that afternoon and hung up feeling both curious and concerned. Grandmother didn't usually ask for visits with such purpose behind them. Tom drove me over to her house a few hours later, the small brick ranch where she'd lived since grandfather died 5 years ago. She was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, surrounded by old photo albums spread across the coffee table and side tables. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, making the dust motes dance in the air. I kissed her papery cheek and settled onto the couch beside her chair. She smiled at me, her eyes bright despite her age. I want to show you something, she said, reaching for one of the albums. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, flipping through pages until she found what she wanted. Here, our 50th wedding anniversary. The photo showed grandmother and grandfather at a party, surrounded by family and friends. They were both smiling, their hands clasped together on the table between them. Grandmother looked radiant in a blue dress, grandfather handsome in his suit. But what struck me most was the way they looked at each other in the photo, like they shared a private joke no one else could hear. See how happy we look? Grandmother's finger traced over the image. That happiness came from choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. She turned more pages, showing me photos from different years. Christmas mornings with young children, backyard barbecues, quiet moments on their porch. People think long marriages are about finding the perfect person, and then it's easy. But that's not how it works. She closed the album and looked at me directly. Your grandfather and I argued about money more times than I can count. We disagreed about how to raise your father and uncle. We fought about whose family to spend holidays with, about his long work hours, about my volunteer commitments. I'd never heard grandmother talk about their marriage problems before. She and grandfather had always seemed like this perfect example of lasting love. But you were so happy together, I said. Grandmother nodded. We were. Because we respected each other's core values even when we disagreed about details. When someone disrespects your values repeatedly, that's not a small thing. That's a foundation problem. She reached over and patted my hand. The dress incident with Courtney wasn't really about the dress. It was about her not respecting what matters to you. James finally saw that pattern clearly, and he realized it extended to how she treated him too. I felt tears prick my eyes. But their kids are going through so much now because of what happened at my wedding. Grandmother shook her head firmly. Their kids are going through this because two people built a marriage on the wrong foundation. Better they see their parents separate and find authentic happiness than watch them pretend for years while resentment grows. You didn't cause this, sweetheart. You just happened to be there when the cracks finally showed. We sat together for another hour while she told me stories about her marriage, the good and the difficult, the compromises and the firm boundaries. By the time I left, I felt lighter, less guilty about the role my dress had played in exposing problems that had existed long before I chose what to wear. That evening, my phone rang again. Aunt Linda this time. I almost didn't answer, tired of family drama, but something made me pick up. I just wanted to tell you something, Linda said without preamble. I've always thought Courtney was too focused on appearances and status. I'm glad someone finally said something. James has seemed miserable for years, but we all pretended not to notice because that's what families do. Her words hit me hard. How many people had watched James struggle in his marriage and said nothing? How many relatives had seen Courtney's behavior patterns and stayed silent to keep peace? Why didn't anyone say anything before? I asked. Linda sighed. Because it's easier to ignore problems than confront them. Because we tell ourselves it's not our business. Because family gatherings are more comfortable when everyone pretends everything is fine. She paused. But you didn't pretend. You stood firm in your choice, and that forced everyone to see what they'd been avoiding. That took courage. After we hung up, I sat on the couch next to Tom and told him about both conversations. He listened quietly, then said what I'd been thinking. A lot of people saw the problems, but you're the one who gets blamed for exposing them. That's not fair, but it's often how it works. I nodded, knowing Tom was right, but still feeling the weight of being the person who forced everything into the open. 3 days after we got back, James texted asking if we wanted to come over for dinner at his new place. He said to bring takeout since he didn't have much in the kitchen yet. Tom and I stopped at this Thai place James liked and showed up at his apartment around 7. The building was older, nothing fancy, and his unit was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. James answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The apartment was small, maybe half the size of the house he'd shared with Courtney. The living room had a couch, a coffee table, and a TV sitting on the floor because he didn't have a stand yet. The kitchen was visible from where we stood, just a galley set up with basic appliances. No artwork on the walls, no decorative pillows, no carefully arranged shelves full of expensive things. It looked like someone had just moved in, which he had, but there was something peaceful about the emptiness. James took the food bags from Tom and started pulling out containers. We sat on the floor around the coffee table since he only had 2 chairs and insisted we take those. As we ate pad thai and spring rolls, James talked about the apartment search, how he'd looked at places twice this size but kept coming back to this one because it felt manageable. Courtney would have hated it, he said. No granite countertops, no walk-in closets, no impressive address to mention at parties. But sitting there with borrowed furniture and takeout boxes, he seemed lighter somehow, like he'd put down something heavy he'd been carrying for years. Tom asked about the kids, and James said they were adjusting okay. Savannah was actually excited about having 2 places, said it felt like an adventure. Nolan was confused, but handling it better than expected. They'd been to the apartment twice already, helped him pick out which bedroom they wanted for sleepovers. After we finished eating, James leaned back against the couch and started talking about his marriage in ways I'd never heard before. He said Courtney's focus on appearances and status made him feel like he was never enough, like every accomplishment got measured against what their friends had, or what people would think. When he got promoted at work, her first question was whether his new title sounded impressive enough. When they went on vacation, she spent more time taking photos for social media than actually enjoying the trip. He talked about how exhausting it was, constantly performing for an invisible audience that Courtney seemed to care about more than their actual relationship. Tom listened quietly, occasionally nodding. while I sat there realizing how much James had been hiding. He said our wedding made him see the difference clearly. Watching Tom and me together, seeing how we made decisions based on what mattered to us instead of what looked good, made him understand what he'd been missing. He said we were on the same team with the same values, while he and Courtney had been playing completely different games. The words hit me hard because I'd never thought about my relationship with Tom that way. But James was right. We wanted the same things, cared about the same stuff, made choices that reflected shared priorities. James and Courtney had been moving in opposite directions while pretending they were together. Before we left that night, James hugged me tight and thanked me for standing firm about the dress. He said if I'd given in to Courtney's pressure, he might have convinced himself that compromising your values for peace was normal, that everyone had to do it. But seeing me refuse to budge made him realize he'd been compromising too much for too long. A week later, Savannah called me asking if we could meet for coffee. Her voice sounded serious, more grown up than her 16 years. We met at this cafe near her school, one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Savannah ordered some complicated drink with extra shots and sat across from me looking tired. She said she'd been thinking a lot about her parents' marriage and what she wanted in her own future relationships. She talked about watching them fight for years, how it was always about money or appearances or what other people thought. She said she didn't want to end up like her mom, always comparing and criticizing, never satisfied with what she had. She wanted to be like me and Grandma, knowing what mattered and sticking to it even when people disagreed. I felt my throat tighten listening to her, this teenager who'd watched her family fall apart and was already trying to learn from it. But I also didn't want her to completely hate Courtney, to only see the bad parts and miss the complexity. I told her that her mom had good qualities too. She was organized, determined, hardworking. She could plan events that ran perfectly, manage complicated schedules, get things done that other people gave up on. Sometimes people's strengths became weaknesses when they got applied to the wrong things. Courtney's drive and attention to detail were great for her job, but when she turned that same intensity toward controlling how everyone else lived, it became destructive. Savannah nodded slowly, seeming to think about this. She said she knew her mom wasn't all bad, that there were good memories mixed in with the difficult ones, but she also said it was hard to remember the good parts when the bad parts had gotten so loud. We talked for another hour about relationships and values and how to know what really matters. By the time we left, Savannah seemed a little less burdened, like talking it through had helped her sort out her feelings. 2 weeks after the wedding, Mom hosted a small family dinner at her house. Just her, me, Tom, James, and the kids. Courtney wasn't invited, which felt both necessary and sad. Mom had set the dining room table with her nice dishes, made a big pot roast with all the sides. Nolan ran around showing Tom his new video game while Savannah helped carry food to the table. During dinner, we talked about upcoming holidays and how to handle family gatherings with James and Courtney separated. Mom suggested alternating holidays, making sure the kids got time with both parents without forcing James and Courtney into the same room. James said Thanksgiving was coming up in a few months, and he wanted to start thinking about it now, rather than waiting until the last minute. Everyone agreed that the kids' comfort came first, that we'd keep adult drama separate from family celebrations. Savannah looked relieved when we said that, like she'd been worried we'd force her to pick sides or referee between her parents. Halfway through dinner, Nolan put down his fork and looked at me with those big, serious eyes kids get when they're about to ask something important. He asked if I was mad at his mom. The table went quiet, and I could feel everyone watching me, waiting to see how I'd handle it. I chose my words carefully, keeping my voice calm and gentle. I told him I wasn't mad, that his mom and I just saw things differently. Sometimes adults disagreed, and that was okay. What mattered was that everyone in this family loved him and Savannah very much, that nothing between the grown-ups changed how much we cared about them. Nolan seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to his food, asking Tom about the video game again. Mom caught my eye across the table and smiled, a small nod that said I'd done okay. After dinner, while Mom and Savannah cleared dishes, James pulled me aside in the kitchen. He said handling Nolan's question like that meant a lot, that he'd been worried about how to help the kids process everything without turning them against their mother. I told him the truth, that I wasn't trying to be a saint. I just genuinely didn't want the kids caught in the middle of adult problems they didn't create. Over the next few weeks, Tom and I started settling into married life for real. The wedding drama faded into the background as we focused on building our future together. We spent weekends looking at houses, talking about which neighborhoods we liked and what we could afford. Tom wanted a garage for his tools, and I wanted a yard for a garden. We talked about career goals, whether I should apply for that promotion at work or wait another year. We talked about maybe having kids someday. Not right away, but eventually. The dress incident felt like it was becoming family history rather than a fresh wound, something that had happened and mattered, but wasn't defining our daily lives anymore. We framed one of the wedding photos and put it on our bookshelf, me in Grandma's dress with Tom's arm around my waist, both of us laughing at something someone had said right before the photographer clicked. Looking at it made me happy instead of stressed, which felt like progress. 6 weeks after the wedding, James called while I was making dinner. His voice sounded tired but certain when he told me he'd filed for divorce. He said he'd tried counseling with Courtney, gone to 3 sessions with a therapist who specialized in marriage problems. But Courtney spent the whole time insisting everyone else was wrong, and she was just trying to help. She couldn't see how her behavior affected people, couldn't accept that her constant criticism and focus on appearances had damaged their relationship. The therapist finally told them that counseling only worked when both people were willing to examine their own behavior, and Courtney wasn't there yet. So James filed the papers, hired a lawyer, started the legal process of ending an 8-year marriage. He sounded sad but certain, which told me this was the right decision for him, even though it was hard. The next day, I got an email from Courtney. The subject line just said, "You need to read this," and I almost deleted it without opening. But something made me click, maybe curiosity or maybe just wanting to know what she had to say. The email was long, at least 3 pages of single-space text. It started with blame, saying I'd destroyed her family by being stubborn about a dress. Then it moved into justification, explaining how she'd only been trying to help me look my best, how she had experience with weddings and knew what worked. Toward the end, there was a tiny bit of acknowledgement that maybe she'd come on too strong about the dress. She didn't actually apologize, didn't say she was sorry for calling my vendors or wearing white or any of the specific things she'd done. But she did say she didn't mean to cause problems, that she never wanted things to end up this way. It wasn't the accountability I'd hoped for, but it was something, a small crack in her wall of defensiveness. I showed the email to Tom that night, reading parts of it out loud while we sat on the couch. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, then said what I'd been thinking. Responding would just restart the conflict cycle. Courtney wasn't ready to really hear me, wasn't at a place where she could accept feedback or take responsibility. I didn't owe her emotional labor right now, didn't have to educate her or help her understand. Maybe someday, but not today. Tom's support in setting that boundary made me feel secure in our partnership, knowing he had my back even when the easier path might be to smooth things over. I closed the email without responding, moved it to a folder in case I needed it later, and let it go. 2 weeks after I closed that email, Mom called early one morning. Her voice sounded tight and worried when she told me Grandma had fallen in her kitchen the night before. Nothing broken, just a bad bruise on her hip and some scrapes on her arm, but the paramedics took her to the hospital anyway because of her age. Mom said Grandma was stable and resting, but they wanted to keep her overnight for observation. I threw on clothes and drove straight to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel too hard. Tom met me there after his morning shift, finding me in the waiting room staring at nothing. When they finally let us back to see her, Grandma was sitting up in bed looking annoyed at all the fuss. She waved away my concern and said she'd just gotten dizzy reaching for a coffee mug, that it was nothing serious. But seeing her in that hospital bed with an IV in her thin arm made something click in my brain. She was 93 years old. She wouldn't be here forever, no matter how much I wanted to believe she was invincible. I sat in the chair next to her bed and took her hand carefully, avoiding the tape holding her IV in place. The words came out before I really planned them, thanking her again for the dress and for showing me what a real marriage looked like. She squeezed my fingers with surprising strength and smiled at me with those clear blue eyes. The dress had been through quite a journey, she said. It saw her through 67 years with Grandpa, all the good times and hard times, and now it was helping me start my own marriage. Maybe someday I'd pass it to my daughter or niece, she added, and the dress would keep going through the family. That idea hit me hard, thinking about the dress continuing for generations, carrying all that history and love forward. My eyes got wet and I had to look away for a second. Grandma patted my hand and told me not to cry, that she was fine and would be back home tomorrow. The doctors released her the next afternoon with instructions to use a walker for a few weeks and be more careful. Mom set up a schedule so someone checked on Grandma every day, and I took 2 afternoons a week to visit and help around her house. 3 months rolled by faster than I expected. James called one Saturday while Tom and I were grocery shopping to tell me about someone he'd been seeing for a few weeks. A teacher named Megan who worked at the elementary school near his apartment, someone a mutual friend had introduced him to at a barbecue. His voice sounded lighter than it had in years when he described her. She was kind and down to earth, he said, not worried about status or appearances. When he mentioned my wedding, she'd thought it was cool that I wore Grandma's dress instead of buying something new. She said it showed I knew who I was and didn't need validation from anyone else. That comment made James realize how different Megan was from what he'd been living with for 8 years. I met her 2 weeks later when James brought her to a family dinner at Mom's house. Megan showed up in jeans and a sweater, no makeup except some lip gloss, and she hugged everyone like we were already friends. She asked Grandma questions about the dress and listened to the whole story with genuine interest. By the end of the night, even Mom was smiling and relaxed around her. Tom whispered to me while we were doing dishes that James looked happier than he'd ever seen him. November came and Tom and I decided to host Thanksgiving at our apartment. We invited James, Megan, the kids, my parents, and Grandma. The space was small, but we made it work, squeezing a folding table next to our regular dining table and borrowing chairs from neighbors. Courtney had the kids for Christmas this year as part of the custody arrangement, so Thanksgiving was our holiday with them. Savannah arrived early to help me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables while I prepped the turkey. She seemed more relaxed than she'd been at the wedding, less tense around the shoulders. While we worked, she told me she was glad her parents had separated. It was hard sometimes, going back and forth between houses and dealing with her mom's moods, but both her parents seemed happier now. Her dad smiled more, and her mom had stopped the constant criticism, at least around the kids. Nolan ran around the apartment with too much energy, excited about the food and the family gathering. Grandma sat in the best chair directing traffic and telling stories about Thanksgivings from decades ago. When we finally sat down to eat, the table was crowded and loud with conversation. Mom stood up with her wine glass and the room got quiet. She proposed a toast to family that supports each other's choices, even when those choices are different from what we might pick for ourselves. To respecting what matters to each person, instead of forcing everyone into the same mold. And to me, she said, for teaching everyone a lesson about staying true to yourself even when people push back. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt this wave of gratitude wash over me. The family had changed shape over the past few months, but it felt more honest now, more real. Early December brought a package to our door. The wedding photos had finally arrived after weeks of editing and processing. I spread them across our coffee table and just stared for a while. The photographer had captured everything perfectly. The delicate beading on the bodice caught the light in dozens of shots, showing the intricate handiwork Grandma had done in 1952. The way the dress moved as I walked down the aisle, the elegant lines of the silhouette, the vintage lace that looked soft and romantic instead of old and dated. There were close-ups of details I'd never really noticed before. Tiny seed pearls sewn into the hem, the way the fabric gathered at the waist. Photos of me and Grandma together at the reception, her face full of joy and tears, my hand on her shoulder as we looked at each other. I spent an entire evening going through every image, reliving the day without all the drama Courtney had tried to create. Tom came home from work and found me surrounded by photos, and we went through them together, picking favorites for frames and social media. I decided to make a special album just for Grandma, filled with close-ups of the dress and photos of us together. It took me 3 days to arrange everything perfectly, adding little notes about what was happening in each photo and which parts of the dress she'd worked on herself. When I brought the album to Grandma's house the following week, she cried happy tears. She held the album carefully, turning each page slowly, touching the photos with gentle fingers. This was exactly how she remembered the dress looking on her wedding day, she said. I'd honored its history while making it my own, adding my own story to the dress without erasing hers. We sat together for over an hour going through the album, and she told me stories I'd never heard before. How she'd sewn each bead by hand over 3 months, working by lamplight after dinner. How she'd chosen that particular shade of ivory because it reminded her of magnolia blossoms. How nervous she'd been walking down the aisle in it, worried she'd trip on the hem. Her grandfather had walked her down the aisle because her father had passed away 2 years earlier, and she'd cried through the whole ceremony. Hearing these stories made the dress feel even more precious, like I was carrying not just fabric and beads, but actual memories and moments from her life. A few days before Christmas, James called with an unexpected message. Courtney had reached out to him asking if I'd be willing to meet her for coffee. She wanted to talk, he said, though he wasn't sure exactly what about. I felt my stomach tighten at the idea. Part of me wanted to just say no and avoid the whole situation. But Tom heard the conversation and encouraged me to at least listen to what she had to say. I didn't have to forgive anything or forget what happened, he said, but maybe there was a chance for some kind of peace. After thinking about it for a day, I agreed to meet, but only in a public coffee shop, and only for an hour. I texted James the details and he passed them along to Courtney. The coffee shop was busy when I arrived, full of people doing last-minute holiday shopping and meeting friends. I spotted Courtney at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked different from at the wedding. Thinner maybe, or just tired. Less put together than usual, wearing a plain sweater instead of her usual designer clothes. I sat down across from her and waited for her to start talking. The first few minutes were awkward, both of us stirring our drinks and not making eye contact. Then she started explaining that she'd been going to therapy since the separation, working through some stuff with a counselor. She was starting to understand why she'd been so focused on my dress, why it bothered her so much that I chose something old and meaningful instead of expensive and new. Her voice was quiet, and she kept her eyes on her coffee while she talked. She said she'd built her whole identity around that expensive wedding 8 years ago, spent so much money and energy making everything perfect and impressive. When her marriage started failing anyway, when all that money and effort didn't create lasting happiness, she couldn't handle seeing me choose meaning over money. It made her feel like she'd wasted everything on the wrong things. I listened without interrupting, watching her face as she talked. It wasn't a full apology. She didn't say sorry for calling my vendors or wearing white to my wedding or any of the specific cruel things she'd done, but it was honest self-awareness, an admission that her behavior came from her own issues and insecurities. When she finished talking, I thanked her for being honest and told her I appreciated that she was working on herself. I didn't think we'd ever be close, I said, but I hoped we could be civil at family events for the kids' sake. They'd been through enough with the divorce and didn't need adults creating more tension. She agreed, nodding quickly, and said that was all she wanted too. We finished our coffee in silence and left on neutral terms. It wasn't friendship or forgiveness, but it was a workable peace that felt realistic, given everything that had happened. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Tom and I were standing in the third house of the day, watching the realtor point out features we barely heard. I kept thinking about how different everything felt now. My marriage was solid, built on something real instead of just excitement and planning. We made decisions together, respected each other's opinions, and never felt like we were competing or keeping score. James had moved into a bigger apartment and seemed lighter every time I saw him, like he'd been carrying weight for years that he finally got to put down. His girlfriend Megan was kind and genuine, and she treated Savannah and Nolan like they mattered instead of like accessories to her image. The family had settled into a new normal that felt more honest even if it was messier. Courtney showed up to events but stayed on her side of the room, and nobody pretended everything was perfect anymore. We all just existed together with less fake politeness and more real boundaries. Savannah called me on a Tuesday afternoon asking if we could meet for coffee. When we sat down, she fidgeted with her cup for a minute before asking if she could borrow grandmother's dress for her junior prom. She wanted to have it altered into a more modern style but keep the basic structure and some of the vintage beading. I was surprised and touched that she wanted to connect with that family history, especially after everything her mom had said about the dress. I told her I needed to talk to grandmother first since it was really her dress even though I'd worn it. Savannah nodded and said she understood, then showed me some sketches she'd made of how she imagined it could look. That weekend I visited grandmother and showed her the drawings, and her face lit up with joy. She immediately started talking about which alterations would work and which wouldn't, planning the whole project with excitement I hadn't seen from her in months. The family barbecue in late spring was the first time we'd all been together since Easter. I stood near the grill watching James flip burgers while his kids played cornhole in the yard. Tom was chatting with my dad about baseball scores, and grandmother sat in her favorite lawn chair telling stories to anyone who would listen. Courtney was there too, staying mostly on her side of the yard with her sister, but the tension was manageable instead of explosive. She'd brought a salad and kept her comments to herself, and when Savannah ran over to show her something, Courtney actually smiled and seemed engaged. The family wasn't perfect or healed or back to normal, but it was real and honest now. People said what they meant, set boundaries when they needed to, and stopped pretending problems didn't exist just to keep peace. Tom found me standing there taking it all in and wrapped his arm around my waist. I leaned into him, feeling grateful for everything that had changed. The dress was back in its preservation box waiting for Savannah's prom, and whatever came after that, but the lessons it had taught our family about being real and respecting what matters were still very much alive. That's where we'll wrap it up today. I'm really grateful you were here to listen. I hope this one added a little warmth to your day.